From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, Revitalizing America. What are the possibilities?
In the classic mythology of old Greece and Homer, ancient mariners feared twin monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, rock and whirlpool garbed in the fantasies of the unknown in the Straits of Messina between Sicily and the toe of Italy. They represented two equally perilous alternatives, neither of which could be passed without encountering and probably falling victim to the other. Mythology deals with the imaginary or fictitious, with gods and demigods and monsters that dwell in the mind. Those who chart the course of the American ship of state in this new decade do not deal with inventions of the mind. The monsters that they must contend with are real, facts of daily life, and the way ahead, a tangle of alternatives so complex and dangerous as to chill the stoutest heart. A safe course must be plotted in defense, the economy, foreign affairs, energy, government regulation, taxes, health, and social and political processes, and each must succeed without falling victim to the others. To examine the course to take us to safe harbor, the way to a revitalized America, we have a highly expert panel. To my far right, Congressman Newt Gingrich, Republican, member of the House Administration, Public Works, and Transportation Committees. To my immediate right, Representative Richard B. Cheney, White House Chief of Staff under President Ford, the new chairman of the Republican Policy Committee in the House, and a member of the Interior and Insular Affairs Committees. To my immediate left, Representative Richard A. Gephardt, member of the Ways and Means and Budget Committees, and appointed Chief of Task Forces, a new position in Democratic Party leadership in the House. And to my far left, Representative Weisfowler, Democrat, a member of the powerful Ways and Means Committee and the Select Committee on Intelligence. Well, to begin, gentlemen, I would pose the same question to each of you. What are the most critical policy issues, the major priorities in public policy? Representative Cheney.
Well, I think, John, that first and foremost, from the standpoint of the Congress and the issues we're going to have to deal with in the months and years ahead, deal very much with the economy. It seems to me we've reached a point in this country where the rate of economic growth is such that we no longer are able to do either of two very important things. One, to provide sufficient public revenues to take care of our public responsibilities, not only in the domestic area, but also in terms of national defense. And secondly, we are no longer able, because of the lack of vitality in our economy, to provide a real prospect for the American people, that their lives of their children will be better than their own, that they can look forward to a bright and optimistic future, situation of economic prosperity to come, and we've lost that very, very important element.
Representative Gephardt.
Certainly one would have to agree that the economy has to be the dominant issue. Upon it depends most everything in our society, and the economy has simply not been working correctly for the past 8 to 10 years, and therefore the Congress will be dominated by that issue. There are lots of sub-issues that relate to it, energy being the most important, and in my view, we will continue to wrestle with that problem through the rest of our lifetimes.
Representative Gingrich.
I think the two major issues that are going to affect us in the whole decade of the 80s are, one, how do we rebuild a sense of trust and dialogue in our political structure so that people have some sense that how they vote matters and that what happens in the elected process means something. And second, how do we reopen the system to new ideas? I think that at every level, what we're seeing are symptoms. I think that inflation and the decay of productivity, the decay of our defense structure, the decay of the bureaucracy, in some ways the collapse of education, are all related to the fact that we're increasingly muscle-bound in a system that no longer is open either to pragmatism or to new ideas.
Representative Fowler?
Well, I would certainly agree with the specifics that my colleagues have just mentioned. I would also like to tag on to what my Georgia colleague, Mr. Gingrich, has said. I think that overarching all of our public policy decisions is the question of how we once again ensure accountability. And the public knows where that accountability lies, where it runs, so that they feel again that they are part of the system in a government by the governed. The other footnote to that is not talked about very much. I think we will see that equally important as any congressional decision, that more and more our lives in this country will be determined, the quality of our lives in this country will be determined by the caliber and the quality of international agreements, equally as much as domestic legislation either emanating from the Congress or from the White House.
Right, the National Academy of Public Administration, a 29-member panel of former cabinet members, governors, labor leaders, members of the Congress, calls for a more strongly united and disciplined Congress, a greater capacity for coordinated action by the President and the Congress, and for a higher level of managerial ability throughout the government than has been customary. How say you to those recommendations as a prescription for the future? Who would like to start it?
Well, they're good recommendations. I think I have greater hope for making the Congress more willing to take on some of the unpleasant decisions that I think have to be made in the next 10 years in order to meet the problems we've discussed. I suppose I'm coming out a bit pessimistic about our ability to achieve much greater levels of competence and managerial ability in the United States government at the federal level. We do not have a system that is a lot like the Japanese system, where the best and the brightest desire public service at the bureaucratic level. We tend to not pay wages that are commensurate with private industry, certainly today with the levels of inflation. So therefore, I don't foresee a time when our executive branch, our bureaucracy, is going to be improved a great deal. Jimmy Carter talked about that a lot. Most every president talks about it, talks about reorganization. We passed a major civil service reform act. It has yielded some good results, but I think on the whole we can't see much positive happening. I have a greater hope that we will have a Congress that is more accountable, that's more willing to take on some of the tough decisions that we have to face. I think in the past few years we've seen, for instance, a budget process which hasn't yielded a great deal of courage, perhaps, in fiscal discipline, but at least we've got a process in place, and hopefully in the years ahead it will yield that kind of fiscal discipline that I think is so important.
Representative Cheney?
Let me differ just a little bit with Dick. I think Congress has been a big part of the problem, I'd have to argue, and that within recent years, power has been diffused within the body to the extent that Speaker of the House, leadership of either party is unable to deliver. When a commitment's made to the President, whatever his party might be, it's almost impossible to build around a commitment by the leader the kind of coalition that's required to pass this program. I think that one of the fundamental problems has been the extent to which we've placed restraints on presidential authority over the last several years. We've been so consumed with the trauma of Watergate and Vietnam that every time we've tampered with the relationship between the executive branch and the Congress, we've done so in a way that's designed primarily to avoid future abuses of power, similar to those that are alleged to have happened in the past. We've been concerned with the so-called myth of the imperial presidency, and I don't think there's any way we can address the public policy agenda that we all talked about at the outset unless we really talk about strong executive leadership, and that seems to me we've got to restore some balance between the Congress on one hand and the executive branch on the other.
Representative
if I can dissent from my good colleague from Wyoming, I think what we need is a stronger Congress, not a weaker. That the greatest danger of the Reagan administration is that conservatives will decide you can trust imperial presidents as long as they're right-wing when they're imperial. That the great problem has been and will continue to be that we need a generation of social invention, that the old system has died, whether it's the big city machine or the Rayburn Congress, and that in the age of television and jet aircraft and computerized letters, we have not yet invented the working political system that will govern us for the next half century. But that system, I think, if we're going to remain a free country, will be focused in the House and the Senate, not in the White House. And that's one of our major problems, is that for 20 years now, we have focused on the wrong institution to save this country. And I think that until we get back to that, and things like the invention of the task force chairmanship that Dick Ephardt has, I think are steps towards inventing a more effective, more mobile, and more fluid system.
Dick, could I follow on that and ask this? It's my sense also that the Congress needs to do a much better job of oversight and evaluation. People have talked for years about sunset legislation, and the Congress doing a better job of overseeing the implementation of programs that it's passed. We aren't doing that yet. I think we'd all admit that. We don't know whether that will ever happen. But don't you agree that that has to happen, or we simply have to keep bumping along the way we are? We can't really, I don't think, today, ask Congress to authorize giant programs, to appropriate money for those programs, and then to step back and hope that the executive branch does what it wants done without knowing what's happening, without asking questions, without really day-to-day overseeing, to a large extent, what is happening. That doesn't mean they tell them how to run the department, but it does mean they have to understand how the law is being implemented so they can either change the law or get rid of it or get rid of the program.
I certainly would agree that we need to do a better job on evaluation and oversight of the executive branch. My problem, though, and speak to Newt's point and follow up on yours too, Dick, you serve on the Budget Committee. I think the budget process has become a joke. We're absolutely, as an institution, incapable of making the kinds of decisions that the budget process seems to warrant. I don't think the solution is going to be found in giving Congress a bigger role than they've had in the past. It seems to me a proper way to go would be for Congress to go ahead and set that overall spending ceiling. But if we're unable to make the hard decisions on program cuts, let's delegate the authority to the President to impound funds within certain broad parameters that we might establish. He used to have that authority. It was used very effectively until the Nixon administration, at which time, because of Watergate, Congress removed that authority from him. I don't think the Congress is ever going to have the courage to do anything about the entitlement programs. But with strong executive leadership, perhaps we can begin to address that very fundamental issue. And you can't talk about addressing the budgetary problems we face and the economic problems we face unless we really are willing to bite the bullet on entitlement programs.
I think, Dick, that you'll agree the problem with the budget process is that we all vote for the popular programs, unwilling to stare a veteran in the face and say, no, I'm not going to double your benefits for the 10th straight year, and go ahead and swell it up and then vote against the final product that we have swelled by our own hypocrisy. And I just don't see how turning that back to the President, first of all, I just don't think it's possible under this kind of system.
He's less of a hypocrite than we sometimes are.
Representative Gingrich.
I think the reason I like the budget system and the fights that we had on the budget is that it is the first real attempt by the House to create a parliamentary environment in which there is some effort at some level to say, here we stand. You can measure us on this vote, and this has an aggregate impact on the whole system. And until you can get to those kind of tough votes that are an aggregate that you can't avoid, because unlike Dick, I don't have any faith in electing presidents who are better than congressmen. I don't think they are better than congressmen, and frankly. I think it's dangerous to think of presidents as being more courageous than congressmen. They just have better speechwriters and better makeup. I think that the congressmen collectively are more accurate reflecting the country. And what you've got to have, in my judgment, is you've got to have a political system that holds us accountable. And at that point, I think somebody's going to have to bite the bullet, even if it takes 3 or 4 cycles of defeat, to finally get to a party that's willing to do it.
But Newt, on that point of accountability, you know, the fact of the matter is there's this enormous dissatisfaction in the country with government. You talked about it yourself. Sure. Great frustration with the way things are going. And yet 96 to 97% of all House members who run for re-election get re-elected.
Not this year.
Well, close to it, not that far off.
Well, I mean, but when Al Ullman loses and Bradamus loses and the Senate changes hands...
But those are because of special situations. But the basic, fundamental, long-term average percentage of House members is well over 90% who want to get re-elected. I mean, the President of the United States is the one, I think, who most accurately reflects broad, fundamental shifts in public opinion.
And I think that's most likely to dangerous.
Well, but see, if you can be concerned about danger, but it seems to me that in times of great national peril in the past, whether we talk about the Civil War or we talk about FDR during the Depression or World War II, We have basically responded as a society to those crises by having the president, whoever he was, assume authority that was extraordinary. And it seems to me, if you're as concerned as I am about the 1980s, then we're talking about a situation again when at a minimum, we have to reduce the trend of the last few years where we've undermined presidential authority rather than granted him additional authority.
Dick, I don't want to, with none of us, I don't think want to keep coming back at you as the point man on this, but I find I'm just very surprised about what you said about the president being the most sensitive to public opinion. I mean, the United States Congress...
Broad national opinion. He is far more close to that.
But see, he doesn't even have any way of doing that. I mean, he can walk around with a bunch of polls that may be outdated a week later, depending on international events. But one of the reasons that Jimmy Carter got beat, I can say this coming from Georgia, is that he did not understand that the people closest to the people in this country, the elected officials closest to the people, were the men and women in the United States Congress. We are the eyes and ears. We are the ones that are home every weekend. We are the ones that are on the ground, sitting and listening to little old ladies telling how their Social Security check has just been eaten alive by inflation, concerned about immigrants coming into Florida, worried about people starving across the ocean, but also having real conflicts as to whether I spend my money when I don't have any money to do it.
But are we capable of making policy decisions to do anything about it? And the answer obviously is no. We can't even pass a budget.
Well, see, whether that's an overall policy decision is, I think, up to discussion, but I'm not willing to concede, or we ought to all go home, that we cannot, along the lines that Newt was discussing, find a way. I'll give the other side of the argument, but giving the same thing that Newt was saying. Not so much that we have a program that helps everybody in a certain way. I think that's one of the problems that we've gotten into, of parceling out the goodies. The American people will support a policy, in my opinion, if they at least know, if they know it hurts, but if they know that everybody is getting hurt equally, that everybody is sacrificing, that you're not exempted because you live on this side of the street or at a certain income or have a certain special interest group working for you, but where we develop a common goal and say, look, it's going to hurt. But if you want to be energy independent, if you want to get the inflation down, if you want to get off of these national deficits, then we all got to sacrifice in some way. I don't think it needs to be done in the tone of a national malaise, as the way President Carter put it. But, you know, as a Rooseveltian, Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, your Roosevelt, not ours, policy of how we get from here to there and what we all have got to do to accomplish it.
The problem I would suggest to Mr. Cheney here and to people who look to a president is that the central purpose of politics in a free society is to be an arena in which somebody has a vision, which they communicate well enough that enough different interests, in Madison's term, that enough different interests come together to pass that vision. And that the gravest danger we face since Franklin Roosevelt is the perennial pursuit of a personality that can transcend by management and administration the political job of knitting together a majority in the House and Senate and knitting together a majority in the country and preaching a change that will help enough people. And you can help them by stopping inflation, or you can help them by new opportunities. But what worries me precisely about, I think, the mindset of the near future is the danger that this administration will decide that, well, it's conservative in economic philosophy, it is in fact radically liberal in a willingness to accrue power. And I think that strong presidents are inherently and fundamentally dangerous to this society because they short-circuit the political education of saying, this is my vision for the 80s, this is where we have to go, this is why I want your vote. And if we don't do that kind of work in the House and the Senate and thereby in the country, because Weich is right, we're the ones that go back, then I think we shouldn't have changes because it'll undermine the whole fabric of society.
Let me just trail on to that a moment. I think Jimmy Carter's greatest failing with Congress was his inability to communicate effectively and consistently and on a regular basis with the members of his own party in the Congress. I'm new here. I have not seen a lot of congressional liaison operations. In my view, this was not a good one because it did not carry on that kind of consistent communication. I'm not saying that if it had been done, that a great majority would have fallen in line on these tough votes that would have had to have been taken. But I agree with Newt that the Congress can work. I agree with him that the budget process, while it has a lot of failings right now, is a significant step forward and can really reach its promise. But it will take inventive, creative leadership from the President and a lot of creative leadership within the Congress, which I think exists there and can be brought into bloom. But clearly it's not there now, and maybe it hasn't been for some time.
Well, let's come down to some of the nuts and bolts of what you have been putting on the table here as critical to the formation of public policy that will give us a more confident and constructive future. Among public policy goals which have been widely discussed are higher defense spending, lower inflation, and significant tax cuts. Now, can we really achieve any of these goals in any real near term?
I think, John, it's extremely important when we talk about those various goals that you have to put them within some kind of time perspective. I think we've got to talk in terms of a 2 or 3 or 4 year period of time, and the bottom line in my mind is that we are not going to be able to meet our defense needs, and we are not going to be able to meet our domestic needs unless we do, in fact, reinvigorate the American economy. Without real economic growth, we simply aren't going to be able to meet our public policy obligations, let alone take care of the private sector, too.
I think you have to reach priorities. I think that's what Dick is saying. I would put the highest priority on controlling inflation, because I think short of doing that, everything else falls apart. I think that takes, among other things, a restrained fiscal policy, a creative, effective energy policy, and a lot of things happening in the private sector in terms of productivity and management, labor relations, and a number of other things that are not happening at this time. I think without addressing that problem as the #1 priority, everything else will fall away. I think if we can achieve a solution to that problem effectively in a 5 to 10 year period, which is what I think it will take, we can then begin to effectively address the other questions that have been put on the table. I think Margaret Thatcher's experience, while we are not England, is a good thing to look at in seeing how long it's going to take and how difficult it will be.
Yes, Representative Gingrich.
First of all, I think that the major problem in this country economically is increasing productivity, increasing investment, increasing new technology. Because I think if you produce enough things over time, they mop up the extra money. I think that if you try to control inflation the way we've tried to for the last 20 years, it's politically impossible in this society. You cannot squeeze inflation out of a democracy, because in the long run, squeezing it out squeezes the public. The public won't stand for it. And if the Republican leadership and the Reagan administration try to squeeze inflation out by severe cuts in spending or by severe cuts in terms of monetary policy, what you're going to see, I think, is a Democratic landslide in 1982. It is not possible, as Margaret Thatcher is proving, to squeeze a free society in 2 years severely enough to change the inflation rate. What you've got to do instead is change the tax code, encourage businesses to invest in new computer systems, new productivity systems, new factories, so that there's enough extra productivity that you can both buy the defense we need and buy the additional homes and the additional goodies and pay the taxes, I think, to at that point balance the budget.
Representative Fowler?
That's not going to work. I say with great respect to my colleague, one of the problems is, of course, I mean, everybody is for increasing productivity in certain industries. I think Dick Gephardt and those of us on Ways and Means, you will see targeted tax credits, exemptions, aids for American industry that will enable them to compete more effectively. But the problem with that philosophy is that, you know, all the world knows how to make everything that we make now. Used to be that we could just gear up production and we could make all these things and nobody else made them, but everybody in the world knows how to make plastic buckets and electric toothbrushes and color television sets. And they're making them. And we can produce all we want and find that they're just not markets for them. And of course, on the international scene, part of the balance of payments and the delicacy of what I mentioned at first of some international agreements is a recognition of the fact that in the production of all these things that they produce and sell, do they get the foreign exchange to buy a lot of our excess wheat and many of the monies that come back into our country. So I would like to think that simply the testing of that philosophy, you know, if we set the Keynesians aside, now we're going to go over and say if we just start producing everything again, all of a sudden our economy is going to sing, but I don't see any evidence of that, though I think that certainly that will be the direction that this new Congress goes in.
Well, economics are known as the dismal science, but even there, nowadays, I think you tend to hear in these problems you find so critical in the statement of priorities with which you open this question of the economy, inflation, and the budget. You find in basic economics they talk about expectations, inflationary expectations, perhaps more dangerous than any of the specific causes which bring about inflation, because the public expects it. Now, does the Congress have the means and the will to try to persuade the American people that inflation is going to be brought under control? Do you feel that you did it, for instance, with respect to energy policy? How long did it take the American people to discover we had an energy problem? And do they really understand it yet?
John, the problem with that whole line of thinking, frankly, is that we're a free society, and that people, generally speaking, are reasonably bright, and that they look at all the different indicators and all the different news shows and all the different advertising, and they make up their own minds. And if they look at a country floundering towards 20% interest rates, they say to themselves, aha, prices are going up. And they don't care what the Council of Economic Advisors says or what the Ways and Means Committee says or what the President exhorts in his latest speech, because they're not stupid. And we have had a consistent series of advice from economists over the years based on the assumption that the public is dumber than they are, which I think, given the track record, is hard to prove. You know, I think that we would frankly be better off literally to ignore economics. I say this as a historian and maybe have a bias in that sense. But I think that economics has not only been the dismal science, it's been the irrelevant science. If we went back to the fundamentals, people produce more when they get more money for producing it. They produce less when they get less money for producing it. And just ignored most of what we've invented with computers in the last 20 years in economics, this would be a far healthier country, and we wouldn't be trying to outguess the American people.
Anybody else want to tackle that one?
No, I like that.
You like that. All right, let me come back. Yes, sir.
I don't like
Task force, yeah. Oh, good. Lay it down.
I think he's right when he says they watch what we do rather than what we say, or what's happening rather than what we're saying. I don't think you can talk people out of an inflationary psychology. I think over a 5 or 10 year period you can convince them that it's not an inflationary time. I don't go as far as Newt does on what you can do on the supply side. I think it's a good theory. I think we've been hung up on consumption and haven't worried about production for too long. I just don't go as far as he does. I think you have to balance it with concern about consumption and concern about your fiscal policy. And I just wouldn't get as carried away as he does and others in his party do about what you can accomplish on that score. But I think there's a great deal of truth in what he's saying.
All right, let's come at it from another direction. If we redirect a substantial portion of our resources to national defense, what specific areas will we redirect these resources away from?
Well, there's no magic in the budget. If you are for a restrained budget, which comes to as close to balance as you can get with all the things we want to do, there's only one place to take the money, and that's from domestic programs, and more specifically, it has to come from some entitlement programs that Dick talked about. There are not enough of what we can call controllable, which is really a misnomer, but everything's controllable in the budget. But we have called a series of domestic programs that are not Social Security or not disability payments, are not black lung payments and what have you, as controllable programs. There are not enough of those, in my view, to cut a budget to get near balance. So you've got to look at Social Security, you've got to look at disability, you've got to look at some of the welfare programs, in addition to health and education and the other so-called controllable items, if you're to free up money, significant money, which I think you have to do for defense.
Yeah, I would point out, I guess, if you go back to the peacetime 50s, when Dwight Eisenhower was president, or the early years of the Kennedy administration, when we were at peace as a country, we spent close to 11% of our gross national product every year on defense. In 1979, we spent less than 5% of our gross national product on defense. And during that same period of time, while we were reducing our overall percentage of GNP on defense, we went roughly from $2 out of every 4 in the federal budget for defense to $1 out of every 4, roughly, for defense. Simultaneously with that, we diverted resources into the domestic area. We adopted the Great Society programs, added the disability program to Social Security. I looked up the numbers the other day on the disability program. When it was set up in 1956, they estimated that by 1980, there would be 1 million people eligible for benefits, and it would cost $860 million a year. The reality in 1980 was that it didn't cost $860 million, it cost $17 billion. And there were 5 million people involved instead of 1. There's been an enormous growth on the domestic side, and I think obviously what you're talking about is a reallocation of those resources, not to the extent that we're going to cut back below the level we're already spending in an area, but that future growth in the budget is going to have to come in the defense area, while simultaneously we put the brakes to the increased spending in the non-defense area. And obviously you're going to have to address, I think, some of the entitlement programs.
Representative Gingrich?
John, let me, if I can, comment on one of the premises of your question. I'm not certain, despite all the rhetoric, that we need to spend dramatically more on defense, although I'm a hawk in most ways. I am certain that we need to spend our money differently on defense. And I think one of the places that the President ought to be looking at to change the budget rather than cut it is inside the Pentagon. I think that there is an incredible amount of waste and lack of effective management in the military. And I think that we have a set of assumptions strategically that are nonsense in the present age, and that we could completely rethink the way we're doing things. And I have a grave fear that we're going to, in effect, spend, let's say, 8% of GNP instead of 5%, feel that we are thereby more safe, and in fact build a Maginot Line behind which we accomplish nothing. I don't see right now any automatic increased security for America by blindly throwing money into the Pentagon and hoping that that scares the Russians. Now, I think on managing the budget, which is a different issue, that Ronald Reagan would do well to study the career of Gladstone, who spent 40 years being a pinchpenny in Britain, and convinced the entire middle class that he looked after their dollars, and that if he didn't have to spend them in the government, he gave them back to them so they could spend them on their own families. I think you start, frankly, with massive decentralization. You take virtually every government grant program, you lump it into 5 or 6 categorical programs, and you give all that money back in a block grant, not category. You give all that money back to the state of Georgia, and you say to the state legislature, figure out how to spend, what we used to give you in 27 different grants. And you eliminate in this city, you have a real estate depression in Washington, because you shift the bureaucracy out of Washington and the decision-making out of Washington back into state and local government. I think that alone would probably save us literally something on the order of $10 to $20 billion in an annual budget.
We'd like to hear from the other side of Georgia.
Well, John, first of all, we have got to, in this country, come up with a redefinition of defense. Defense is just not more and more missiles and more technological systems. Defense is getting off a $90 billion heroin-like habit on imported energy, which is threatening our national security because of our profligation in energy use in its relationship to the rest of the world. Defense is taking some real risk in foreign policy. That we have had problems in the Congress reaching even the beginnings of consensus, either within our party or in league with the Republicans. When Robert Mugabe, who campaigns as a Marxist, then comes to Washington and says, look, we have a freely elected government in Zimbabwe. We don't want the Russians in there, but we need your help to the tune of $45 million, not billion, million, to try to help us keep the Russians out. We don't want them. They just take over your country. We want to follow your westernized trends, and we shut the door. Same in Nicaragua. Nobody knows whether or not they're going to go running to the Russians 1 year or 2 years or 2 weeks later. But the point is, you've got to take some risk around the world to make some friends that will be your allies in difficult times. We could spend till the cows come home, and we could not field an army on the Soviet border to protect either Afghanistan or Poland, in my opinion. We could spend till the cows come home with all sorts of new technological systems. And if we had to draw the line in the Horn of Africa, either in and around Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, we could not do it. Because we look at defense spending only in terms of new Trident submarines and MX and all the technological gadgets, and ignore the rest of the world who are rapidly choosing sides to say, we either want to be on the side of the United States because they're our friend, or we'd like to go over to the Soviets because they help us when we need help.
In this whole area of foreign policy, which I'm glad you raised, and public policy, do you see a new direction and perhaps a more effective and efficient use of public policy in the field of foreign affairs in the reaction to Afghanistan and the Polish crises in 1980, i.e. an almost acceptance that we are militarily incapable of acting, but that we will organize such economic punishment and public relations punishment that we could perhaps stop the Soviet ambitions? Do you find this a new approach, an effective approach, Mr. Gingrich?
John, you've covered a lot of this over the years, and there has always been, despite the occasional headlines, an American assumption that we had neither the interest, the desire, nor the will to exert military power within reach of the Soviet border. We never, under Eisenhower, Kennedy, anyone, thought that we could help Poland. Franklin Roosevelt didn't think we could help Poland and basically made a deal. And that's always been our policy, that Poland will be as free as the Soviet Union allows it to be. We have no interest in Afghanistan at the present time, have never had any. And I think that you have to look very carefully at what we want to accomplish with our policy. We have defended Europe very ably, I think, and very cheaply for 35 years now, on the assumption that if you keep a large enough garrison army there and enough dependence there, that a Soviet invasion of Europe means nuclear war and that there are no risks they'll take leading to nuclear war in Europe. We've defended Japan under exactly the same premise, and then on occasion we have stumbled into various and sundry secondary wars, Vietnam being the least admirable example, both in efficiency and maybe in wisdom. I think we have to think through our policies. And we're currently not doing that. What has happened in the last 2 years is the largest swing in public opinion since 1939. What we have seen is a general view, I think not that we're inferior per se, but that military force makes a difference. And I think in that sense, the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian crisis, which I think had much more to do with our nationalism right now than Afghanistan, and finally Poland, do mean that there's a broad public feeling that the world is dangerous and we have to be capable of surviving in it. I think that's where we're at.
Representative Gephardt?
Well, I think the actions taken by the President with regard to the Soviet Union after Afghanistan were a departure in public policy to some extent from what we've done in the past. It was an exertion of linkage, if you will, in the Soviet relationship. It was an attempt to treat their bad behavior with punishment. I think it had an effect. Will it stop them from going into Poland? Probably not. But did it have an effect? I think it did. And I think it was a constructive effect. And I think we all, however, agree that having sufficient military power as one of our foreign policy tools is absolutely necessary, and that since Vietnam, whether we like it or not, we've allowed that military machine to fall into a certain state of disrepair which has to be remedied.
All right, I think that we have opened up this whole issue of the possibilities of the future. We've certainly decided the possibilities for revitalizing America are numerous, but that the achievement of the goals is going to be a hard road. And it's time for us to have a question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
I'm Howard Pennyman. I'm from American Enterprise Institute and Georgetown University. Could I go back to some of the very early discussion? The question of whether people represent their district or represent the United States is an old question. Woodrow Wilson said as far as a century ago that American congressmen represented their district and not the nation as a whole. Every basic reform, whether it be to change the electoral system or to reform the Congress, has tended to further fragment and decentralize the Congress. One of the results is, it seems to me, and I'd like to ask all of you to comment on it, is that it has so made congressmen represent their districts that they both, A, believe deeply in cutting the budget, and B, in never cutting it, where it would hurt anybody among those who have interest in their districts.
All right, who'd like to start with that? You look like a good, bold, brave man.
Well,
J.D.?
I think most of us attempt to achieve some kind of balance. I mean, after you've campaigned for a year or 2 years, or in the case of Mr. Gingrich from Georgia, 3 separate times before you win, you feel that you have a common identity with your constituents. And I think most members probably, when it comes time to cast a vote on a key issue, rarely feel a tug between, on the one hand, so-called national interest, and on the other hand, district interest. You rationalize in your own mind that what your constituents want and what you want is what's right for the country. It's those fellows on the other side that are representing the special interest in their district. So that the choice in the mind of the congressman, I think, is rarely framed in those clear-cut terms.
I think your attitude toward voting is in large part dependent upon your last majority. If you won by 50.00001%, I think you keep your ear pretty close to the ground in preparation for the next campaign. If you won by 95% of the vote, I think you vote fairly freely, according to the dictates of your conscience, whether that be in line with your district and what it thinks and what the majority thinks, or what would be seen as a national position.
Doesn't this still send you back to Congressman Cheney's position about giving authority to the president to carry out the cuts which you talk about?
Let me make a comment, because I don't know, political science has done an enormous disservice to government in this country because it is almost completely ahistorical. The founding fathers deliberately designed one branch of the government to be permanently scared, and that's why they have them run every 2 years. It is a deliberate design function. They specifically want us to speak for the district, and they have the rather naive belief that if a president can't find 218 districts that gain more than they lose from a particular bill, that bill ought to be defeated. Now, I think, by George, you're supposed to speak for the people of your district, because that's who you understand and that's who you represent, and that you collectively, as the House, represent the country. And I think any congressman who gets up and says, well, this will destroy my district economically, but in the national interest I want to do that, is in fact betraying their specific commitment in the Constitution. And I find it very, frankly, naive and destructive in the long run to keep favoring a general good which has no specific good. Because I don't think there is a general good for the country as a whole which you can't piece together in 218 districts.
But Newt, wouldn't you agree then on that basis? And I think this goes back to the question that was asked, that given the constitutional arrangement, given our mandate as congressmen to represent our districts, that in looking for that spark, that dynamic spark or leadership or initiative that is going to set the agenda and help solve the problems, we have to look to the presidency, that is more likely to be the arena in which the answers are found than in the Congress.
It is specifically and precisely in the Federalist Papers and in almost all the writing of the Founding Fathers a concern that we have effective leadership in the Congress, because it is among the congressmen that you should make the compromises and the understandings and the level of political sophistication necessary both to manage the people who we pay, the bureaucrats, and to rearrange the legislation for our constituents. And it is the failure of our generation to produce effective political and congressional leaders in the Congress that leads us, I think, to the very grave danger in the long run of tyranny.
We would be most interested to hear from you, Mr. Fowler.
Thank you. Speaking of tyranny.
Well, I think it may be naive, and I will admit to that, but to respond to Mr. Gingrich, what we need in the United States Congress are men and women who are not afraid to lose, who do not see this as a lifelong profession, to service a constituency so readily, and only that constituency, in every little whim of public policy that the breeze may blow, to simply perpetuate them in office. Now, I know that it's a lot easier to say than to do. If they're going to close a military base in your district to build a more modern one somewhere else, that is in the national interest to do so. It is not in the economic interest of that member's district. That's when you earn your pay. To vote to close it in your district in order to achieve the national interest to modernize your defense establishment. I mean, these questions have been debated, but we are not, 535 men and women are not city councilmen. We're not state legislators. We shouldn't be ward politicians catering to whatever sense of information and purpose that comes on a weekly basis, or you will never mold any national policy. But the problem is that we want to stay here. So most of us are afraid to vote on any given issue in something that's too brave, because then we get thrown out next time. And,
Can I go back on it? I think the question is perhaps not as well put as it could be. Most issues don't break down very neatly, as I think Dick said, into a district interest and a national interest. It breaks down between what you perceive as being both in the interest of your district and the national interest, and an interest group that is usually represented in your constituency. Let's take the example of the twice-a-year COLA for federal retirees, the cost of living adjustment. I think most members probably felt that that was a change. Making it a once-a-year cost of living adjustment was a change that was in order, that was legitimate and appropriate. But each of us had 3 or 5 or 6,000 federal retirees sitting in our district, writing letters, making telephone calls, and so people, a lot of people before an election, did not want to vote against that large group when you're winning by 1,000 or 3,000 or 6,000 votes. That, to me, is the way a lot of issues are presented, and I don't think it breaks down as neatly as perhaps your question suggests.
All right, may I have the next question, please? Yes, sir.
I'm John Hellman. I'm from the University of Washington, Seattle, and AEI. And I relaying a question as chairman of a Department of Political Science from my students, because I've been quite amazed to hear 4 congressmen talk about revitalizing America without directly addressing the question of revitalizing Congress. The mood, if I may repeat my students, is that Washington is a subculture, that congressmen do not act as statesmen. They simply represent those interests that have access to them, be they local constituents or Washington interest groups. They rarely transcend the immediate. They do not provide a basis for leadership for the country. I call to your attention also repeated public opinion polls expressing approval, which rarely exceeds 30% of the performance of the role of Congress, and one taken in the early, well, I guess about 1974, where congressmen were rated above trash collectors and below barbers in terms of professional respect. I would like to raise the question to all of you. What is wrong? And do you think anything can be done to alter the image of Congress? Because the perception out there is not that you are doing a superb job, but that somehow you are doing a job that must be done, but not doing it very well.
Mr. Fowler has volunteered.
well, let me wade in where angels fear to tread for your students, to say that first I would say to your students that in a free society, in a representative system, that you get the kind of government that you deserve. If you tolerate apathy in your public officials, you get apathy. If you tolerate corruption, then you get corruption. Because we are still a government by the governed, by those students and the people in this room and people throughout the country. That Congress will never be any greater in its statesmanship than the values and the hopes and the demands of the American people. We have the same faults. They are certain because we are representative and come from a system where we are elected every 2 years. We mirror those hopes and those aspirations and those faults. That means you get a certain number of blue-eyed people, you get a certain number of alcoholics, you get a certain number of any other trend that you want to put on your computer. But back to the question that we discussed before, the real question is in a pluralistic society where you've got black people and Spaniards and rich people and poor people, how on any given vote can you be truly representative? I represent a district that's 50% black and 50% white. A district where the gap between the number of high-income people and the number of low-income people, that gap in between is greater than any other congressional district in the country, according to all these computer operators. So the question that I would ask to your students is, how can you be, on any given vote, truly representative? You can't. I know that on any given vote, I'm not going to make 50% of them mad, but probably 80% of them mad when I cast a vote that I deem to be in the national interest. But you have to turn this question back in a free society to the people who are the electorate, because they are the government in this country. And again, they're going to get what they deserve in their representatives in Washington.
Sire?
I think that Congress itself has to bear a great deal of the blame for the way government's perceived, because we probably do as much communicating as anybody in America today. Next to Walter Cronkite and the people on the evening news shows, we send out newsletters, we make speeches, we visit with our constituents. To the extent that the American people have a perspective on government, I think to some extent we're responsible for having created that. We create it by castigating the courts and condemning the bureaucracy and worrying about alleged abuses of presidential power by presidents. And we also, I think, have failed in the very important respect of being reflective about what our role and our responsibility is. Yes, we do have to be representative. Yes, we do have to pass appropriations bills and conduct oversight. But we don't debate the great issues of the day. We spend hours and hours and hours on absolutely idiotic procedural questions. We don't get into the basic fundamental issues that I think the American people often feel ought to be the central concern of their government. And to some extent, we brought it on ourselves.
I think your students are probably basically right. I think that there are two instances or two conditions which will change the condition of Congress. One is if more of your students will take it upon themselves to run for Congress rather than going into the business world to make a big buck. Or secondly, if we have a catastrophe in the country and people really begin to worry about what Congress is doing. As Dick said, 95% of us get reelected. If we're not exerting leadership, then the American people don't want leadership, because they're reelecting people that your students say are not giving them leadership. I think as long as things were going along relatively well, and they have been for 40 or 50 years up until about the last 10, nobody really cared.
Can I come a step further, Dick, and get you, both of you, because you're both Democrats and just went through a tough election in terms of your party at large. It seems to me that one of our great problems is that each of us is individually perceived as a very effective representative. That the problem is that Congress in the aggregate is not able to function. It's an anti-synergism, whatever that word is, that we bring together each of the 435 parts and we somehow become less than the sum of the whole. And I think that's been one of our great problems. We're all much better as individuals than we are as a team.
You know, I was running around my district and I looked at this high school that I used to go to, a public high school. I couldn't figure out how it was different. It looked different. I could tell, but I couldn't. It took me 20 minutes of looking at it. And all of a sudden I realized that it was this one tremendous parking lot around it. We didn't have cars 20 years ago when I went to high school. Now everybody's got their own car. So when your students start worrying about whether or not, why we don't have an effective energy policy in this country, ask them how many of them would be willing to be statesmen and give up those cars until we got our imported oil bill down from $90 billion a year to $10 billion a year. And we'll test statesmanship at both ends.
But Weish, I sense that your students are asking for tough leadership decisions like a gas tax. John Anderson was very popular on college campuses. He talked about tough solutions to tough problems. And I think what you're saying is that that's what they're asking for. And I would just suggest back that that will happen when either we have a catastrophe and then people demand those kinds of things happen, or are willing to have a consensus forum in that regard, or until we get 219 people in the House and 51 people in the Senate who perceive that kind of thing. I'm not saying that's necessarily a right policy, but those kinds of things are necessary to do.
You should go ahead and endorse my policy.
I'm for the gas tax. I voted for it.
One final remark. The students want to believe. I think that is an interesting point. Enrollments in political science are up 50-60% over the last 2 years. And the interest in governance and governmental institutions is truly growing. And Anderson's appeal was very substantial around altruistic symbols. I think the complaint about Congress is they don't find inspiration. They don't find something there that they can look to as more than a mirror of the society. Maybe it can't be more than that, but that's somehow what they want.
Anybody else wants to talk to this?
One last
Yes.
radical thought. What if, in fact, the reason we are floundering around in the Congress is because the country's floundering around? What if, in fact, it is the nature of a free society to take long periods to talk to itself, to sort things out, to move slowly so as not to crush any single group? And that one of the things that our students are going to have to learn in the long run is that to be free is on occasion to be impatient, to be frustrated, and to have to work awfully hard to get anything done, because that is in fact precisely what freedom takes. And I think in that sense, if you look at our record compared to Nazi Germany or compared to Soviet Russia, we don't do all that bad a job over 20 years, although certainly we do a terrible job over 1 year.
All right, this concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our hearty thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Congressman Newt Gingrich, Richard B. Cheney, Richard Gephardt, and Weiss Fowler, and of course also to our guests and experts in the audience for their participation.
It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by doing so, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. Information on this and other subject areas, including government regulation, economic policy, social security and retirement, health policy, legal policy, tax policy, political and social processes, energy policy, defense policy, and international affairs, is available from the Institute. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.